Maybe we'll dispense with the mic. I've got the added height now. So I'm taller than Edward Lucas. This is excellent. Welcome, everybody, to our first Christmas drinks at the Adelphi. This time a year ago, we were on the 14th floor, bidding farewell fondly to the tower, feeling very nostalgic, I think, and somewhat, many of us, a little worried about what lay ahead. And I think a year later, we are fully at home here. We've had floods, we've got refugees, but it's all great. And thank you once again to the large number of people who made it so great, who made the move so simple, and who have ensured, and many of you are here tonight, who have ensured that we have settled in incredibly fast to our new home. So to all of you, thank you. But the fact that I have an enormous package of papers here is testament to something else, that today is actually a slightly sad day, because it is a day that we bid farewell to Edward Lucas, a man who has written for The Economist for nearly 30 years. He started writing in 1989. He too has written for practically everybody in the group, including a stint for the EIU from Vienna. He, of course, began his career writing about Central Europe, never Eastern Europe, then Russia, and has been international editor, energy editor, and, of course, most recently, espresso editor. He's a man who has inspired, impressed, and occasionally exasperated generations of his colleagues. And his departure, I think, is a sign, more powerful sign, frankly, than the Trump doctrine, or indeed the 19th Party Congress, that we are in a tectonic shift in global politics. It truly is the end of the post-Cold War era. We're in a newer, nastier, more dangerous world. Because Edward has decided that it's no longer enough to be a journalist, that the stakes are simply too high. He's decided he must devote himself to security policy advocacy. Now that is a huge gain for the West. It's a huge loss to us. Feels a bit like the Security Council without a permanent member, or MI6 without Bond. Edward really has been one of our most outstanding journalists. He epitomizes, I think, pretty much everything that The Economist aspires to be. First of all, he's immensely clever. He is everything that James Wilson would have expected when he wrote about the severe contest between intelligence that presses forward and timid ignorance. He's a genuine liberal. He epitomized what Geoffrey Crowther thought of when he said The Economist stands for the radical centre. Edward is a radical centrist. He's indeed a paid-up member of the Liberal Democrats. He's a polymath. Edward speaks 5 languages: German, Russian, Polish, Czech, and I'm told Lithuanian. He built his own computer in the 1970s out of a kit that he won in a competition. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of all manner of things, from libel law to English hymns, which he sings loudly on his Brompton bike. He is, of course, the world's greatest champion of the Baltic states. He fell in love with countries that he called the captive states in his youth, and that ardour has never diminished. He was the first man to get a visa to Lithuania, the first e-citizen of Estonia, and he is a household name throughout the whole region. He flies the Estonian flag in his office, he cultivates Estonian chilies in pot plants, and he houses dangerous Estonian liquors on his shelf. The best summary of this was one that I got from John Micklethwaite, who wrote to me as follows. If you go to any tedious diplomatic party anywhere in the world, there was always a moment when somebody with slightly mad-looking eyes and an East European accent, either very beautiful or wearing a cassock, and sometimes both, approaches you and then asks with great intensity, "Do you know Edward Lucas?" It is then likely that several other guests will back away in a slightly terrified way, but the party certainly never stops being boring. Edward is also immensely productive. He's the author of 4 hugely successful books. He has filled most British broadsheets with copy on Russia when he's ostensibly working for us. He's also written extraordinarily prodigious amounts for us. The speed with which he writes is legendary. His first book, I'm told, took 6 weeks to write.
4.
Edward would subtly mention at Wednesday lunches that he could start and finish a note on a tube journey of half an hour. And Simon Long, who shared his office, once reported a phone call where Edward said, "How many words do you want? 1,000. I'll get it to you within an hour." He is also truly eccentric. One of the first times I met Edward, actually I'd met him once or twice before, but he came to stay with me in Washington, where Sebastian and I had a a house with an unheated cellar room, one that I think the previous owners kept their illegal immigrants in, housekeepers in. Edward stayed there despite the fact that it was the middle of winter. He left at dawn for clandestine meetings, no doubt at the CIA, with no coat. He also loved singing, especially Rule Britannia in a Finnish sauna in his garden. Or hymns when negotiating Hyde Park Corner. He swims daily in the Serpentine. In the tower, he used to climb every day to the 13th floor. Now, much of this I knew. I know Edward reasonably well, at least I thought I did. And I thought I knew plenty to say a few words upon his farewell. But I thought I would ask my colleagues just in case. And in the last 48, 72 hours, I have realized just how wrong I was and how I didn't know the half of it about Edward. I have had a deluge of anecdotes and stories about Edward that will literally fill a small book, and which I will in due course send to you. So many that I can't do them all justice. But being, as you know, someone who likes to think of things in threes, particularly in leader points, I have divided them, the key ones, into three categories. The first, let's start with, as I would say in a leader, Edward the Practical Joker. This missive is from Robert Guest. Edward is a practical joker of great skill and with no mercy. One time he sent Robert Guest an email purporting to be from a consultant to the HR department, telling him that he and his colleagues would be required to attend a week-long residential course to raise their awareness of diversity, inclusion and identity issues. When Robert replied that he was a bit busy, and a week sounded like rather a long time to be away from his day job, not to mention his family, the diversity guru replied in jargon that grew steadily more irritating. Robert's negative feelings were an excellent thing, he was told. He would be able to explore and harness them and turn it into a truly growthful experience. Dear Bob, said the guru, the fact that you don't want to do this makes it all the more essential that you spend the entire week doing it. As Robert began to swear at his computer screen, he turned and saw a figure lurking in the doorway with an evil grin on his face. Second is from Matthew Valencia. When, after the sale of the tower, its new owners sent a note round telling cyclists that they would no longer be able to take their bikes up to their offices, a miffed Edward immediately hatched a plan. He wrote a long, hilariously faux earnest letter to facilities, explaining that he was, quote, on the spectrum, and that having to change his routine would be most detrimental to his well-being. I have a copy of that email. It is utterly convincing. It sent Tishman Speyer into a huge tizzy that went via HR all the way to Oscar, our company secretary, who took it extremely seriously. Needless to say, Edward got his way. He has also, I'm told, from several people, an imaginary Russian assistant called Boris. When PR people ring up, Edward answers in Boris's voice. Sorry, Mr. Lucas cannot be awake, he drunk, and he's very dangerous drunk. There is also an apocryphal story, but possibly too good to check, that he called up the foreign editor, pretending to be from the Russian authorities. When he was put through to this person, he said, I want the organ grinder, not the monkey. I also have plenty of evidence in these pages of Edward's eccentricities. He is much more eccentric than I had realized. He asked Ush, who is his assistant at that point, to reply as Mrs. Thrib, his personal assistant, when he engaged in correspondence with people he did not like. But this one, for me, takes the biscuit. This is from Liz Mann. I do remember he once took out a needle and thread and started sewing up a hole I had in my jumper while I was wearing it. Didn't ask me, just started sewing. I thought that was quite unusual. He did do a good job. But the biggest message that comes through from this great sheaf of papers are endless stories that show that Edward is a wonderful, generous, and thoughtful colleague. Matthew Valencia again. One of the many cases where I benefited from his kindness was when I took over from him as business and finance correspondent in Germany. Not only did he throw a party to introduce me to his contacts, he spent hours going through the business cards he'd collected there, scribbling on them. One note described a business leader as, quote, powerful but pompous. Another warned a diplomat was fond of The Economist, but a sinister bastard. I also recall Edward pulling me aside when I arrived in Berlin and saying, "Whatever you do, don't spend less than I spent here." Bruce Clark, who shared an office for many years with Edward, wrote the following: "Whoever decided that Edward and I should be office mates must either have a great sense of humour or a great faith in a higher power. Never in The Economist's impressive annals have so many deeply arcane interests been pursued, so many rare languages spoken, so many contacts maintained with places that are far, in every sense, from London SW1. Commonality doesn't always make for perfect harmony, but my memory is that we rubbed along pretty well. It helped that we had some joint reference points which would have been obscure to most people. When co-writing a story about new legal terminology, neither of us could resist dragging in the old story of a judge who was about to sentence a thief from Yorkshire. The judge asked the nervous young lawyer, "Does your client understand the principle of nemo dat quod non habet?" "Indeed, my lord. In Barnsley they speak of little else." Wonderful answer. Edward is a man with unusual qualities. His combination of fearlessness, resourcefulness, passion, integrity, confidence, and amiability. They are not often found. They also, I would have you know, happen to match very closely the qualities the CIA looks for in a candidate, and the qualities that a successful intelligence officer must possess. I looked this up earlier this week, and I found a website offering advice for those who wish to join the CIA, which mentioned exactly those qualities. Arcadi wrote the following: "I don't know if Edwards was a spy, but he certainly provided the best security cover for all subsequent Moscow correspondence. Whenever a Kremlin spokesman raised an issue with a Putin cover, all one had to do was shrug shoulders, look meaningly towards the ceiling. 'Lucas,' a Kremlin spokesman would sigh with a great deal of respect and admiration. Edwards' tweets and public performances were scrutinized, analyzed, studied, and copied. In Putin's eyes, The Economist was a branch of MI6, and Edward was not just a regular spy, but was in charge of Active Measures Department, ideological subversion. I think the entire RT operation was designed with Edward in mind." So, Edward, you are on Mr. Putin's wavelength, you are on his radar and in his league, and you are clearly to us the man who came in from SW2. Before, however, I give the floor to you, I wanted to end on two notes. The first, as a committed espresso man, I want to make sure that you know that espresso has not been neglected amongst this revelry, and I want to give you an early preview of the top gobbet tomorrow. Written by Patrick Lane, and you'll be pleased to know that it is precisely 150 words. "Dear Edward, a legend departs. After more than 2 decades, he leaves The Economist today, most likely pedalling his well-lit Brompton bicycle. The journalist and author, second Cold War warrior and Estonian e-citizen, has written on everything from Eastern Europe to cryptography, but a few colleagues will recall Edward Lucas most fondly in a less celebrated role, as the driving force of Espresso, the paper's daily news app. Granted, not everyone has fond memories of those days. Recalcitrant correspondence from Berlin to, Berlin, knew the meaning of snark. His fellow baristas occasionally had their patience tested too on discovering that Mr. Lucas would be editing chunks, writing gobbets, and loading the editorial system from a taxi in Tallinn or a hotel in Helsinki. Rumours persist that there were in fact several Mr. Lucases cloned in a secret laboratory in rural Somerset. To some, only this can explain his prodigious output. However many they are, they'll be missed. Author Lane, seen by EL, research none." And now, just finally to end, actually, with a slightly more serious note. And this is from Zanny, and I think it encapsulated the very best of Edward particularly well. "You have probably got quite enough zanily amusing anecdotes about Edward, but we mustn't forget the serious points, which I look back on with some poignancy, particularly from my time as Europe editor, when he was in Russia and Central, never Eastern, Europe. Edward is a true hero to the Balts, rightly so. He boosted and defended them at a time when few people believed they could get out from the Soviet Union. I remember a Ditchley conference in the early 1990s, when it was the overpowering consensus that they would never become members of the European Union, let alone NATO. But Edward pressed on, insisting they should join both organisations. It was he who got it right. On Russia too, there were times when many of us, including me, thought he was over the top in his hostility to Putin. But his robust adversarial view has been vindicated. He was quick too to point out the crookedness of the Russian oligarchs, when many of us, again including me, were loath to accept quite how venal many, even most of them were, almost right from the post-Soviet beginning. So while always enormously enjoying Edward's vivid and sometimes polemical prose, his argumentative brilliance, and his company as a very long-standing, loyal and most amusing friend, I still more admire his sense of history, his perspicacity, his readiness to go against the trend, and above all his courage. We will miss him very much indeed. How right Zanny is. Edward, thank you for everything. We will miss you.